the gentle lapping of the Nile against reed boats, the distant sound of workers hauling limestone blocks, the soft whisper of papyrus rustling in the desert wind. Close your eyes and let us transport you back 4,000 years to a world so foreign, so dangerous, and so utterly unforgiving that your modern sensibilities would be your death sentence within days. Picture this. You've somehow been transported back to ancient Egypt during the height of the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE. The sun beats down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, and the first thing that hits you isn't the heat, it's the smell. The overwhelming cocktail of human waste, rotting fish, incense, and the metallic tang of blood from nearby animal sacrifices would send your modern stomach into immediate revolt. You're standing in Memphis, the great capital city, and already you're making fatal mistakes. Your clothes, whatever modern garments you arrived in, mark you as an outsider. But it's not just your appearance that's problematic. It's everything about how you move, speak, and react to this world that would immediately brand you as either a spy, a madman, or something supernatural. The first Egyptian you encounter speaks in Middle Egyptian, a language that sounds nothing like any modern tongue. Even if you somehow knew hieroglyphs, spoken Egyptian of this period would be completely incomprehensible. Your attempts to communicate through gestures would be misinterpreted, possibly as threats or religious blasphemy. In a society where every gesture has meaning and social context is everything, you'd be committing cultural crimes with every movement. Within minutes, you'd attract attention from the local authorities, the Medjay police force. These aren't the romanticized guardians you might imagine from movies. They're hardened men who maintain order through brutal efficiency. Your inability to explain yourself, your strange appearance, and your obvious confusion would mark you as a threat to social stability. In ancient Egypt, social stability was considered divine order, and disrupting it was not just a crime, it was an offense against the gods themselves. The Medjay would likely assume you're either a foreign spy, a escaped slave who's lost his mind, or worse, someone possessed by malevolent spirits. Any of these assumptions would lead to immediate detention, and detention in ancient Egypt was far from the due process you might expect. You'd be dragged before a local official, unable to explain yourself, unable to prove your identity or status, and unable to understand the charges against you. But let's say, miraculously, you somehow avoid this immediate fate. Let's assume you manage to blend in just enough to avoid instant arrest. Even then, you're facing challenges that would overwhelm any modern person within hours. Your first biological need would be water, and this single requirement would likely be your doom. The Nile, which appears as a lifeline in this desert civilization, is actually a death trap for your modern immune system. This isn't the filtered, chlorinated, bacteria-free water your body is accustomed to. This is water teeming with parasites, bacteria, and microscopic organisms that ancient Egyptians had built immunity to over generations. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic worms, was endemic in the Nile. These microscopic larvae would penetrate your skin the moment you came into contact with the water. Not just drinking it, but even walking through it or washing with it. The larvae would migrate through your bloodstream to your liver and bladder, causing chronic infection that would debilitate you over weeks and months. Guinea worm disease was another constant threat. By drinking water contaminated with infected water fleas, you'd ingest larvae that would grow into meter-long worms inside your body. After about a year, these worms would emerge through your skin, typically through your feet or legs, causing excruciating pain and crippling infections. The water would also expose you to cholera, dysentery, and various forms of hepatitis. Your modern gut microbiome, adapted to processed foods and sterile environments, would be completely overwhelmed by the bacterial load in ancient Egyptian water sources. Severe diarrhea would set in within hours, leading to rapid dehydration in the desert climate. Ancient Egyptians dealt with water quality through several methods that you wouldn't know about or have access to. They often let water settle in large jars to allow sediment and some organisms to settle out. They sometimes filtered water through cloth or sand. Most importantly, they frequently consumed beer instead of water. Not because they were alcoholics, but because the brewing process killed most harmful organisms. But you wouldn't know any of this. You'd drink the water because you had to, and within 24 hours, you'd be experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress that would leave you weak, dehydrated, and vulnerable to everything else that was trying to kill you. Assuming you survive your first encounter with Egyptian water, your next challenge would be food. Ancient Egyptian cuisine, while sophisticated for its time, would present immediate and long-term threats to your survival. The bread, which formed the staple of every Egyptian's diet, was nothing like modern bread. It was made from emmer wheat, ground on stone querns that left small particles of sand and stone in the flour. This gritty bread would wear down your teeth at an alarming rate, a process that killed many ancient Egyptians through infected tooth roots that led to sepsis. But the bread presented more immediate dangers. Ancient Egyptian grain storage was plagued by ergot contamination. Ergot is a fungus that grows on grains and produces powerful alkaloids similar to LSD. Consuming ergot-contaminated bread would cause ergotism, a condition that included hallucinations, seizures, and gangrene of the extremities. For someone from the modern world with no understanding of what was happening to them, ergot poisoning would seem like madness or divine punishment. The meat available to you would be equally problematic. Refrigeration didn't exist, so meat was either consumed immediately after slaughter or preserved through salting, drying, or other methods that you wouldn't recognize as safe. Trichinosis from undercooked pork, various bacterial infections from spoiled meat, and parasitic infections from improperly prepared fish would all be constant threats. Ancient Egyptians consumed a lot of fish from the Nile, but these fish were often infected with liver flukes and other parasites. Without proper cooking knowledge, and without understanding which fish were dangerous during which seasons, you'd be consuming parasites that would cause chronic liver damage and other serious health problems. The fruits and vegetables, while seemingly safer, presented their own challenges. Without modern pesticides, produce was often contaminated with various pathogens from the soil and water used to irrigate it. More importantly, you wouldn't know which foods were safe to eat raw and which required preparation. Beer, the universal beverage of ancient Egypt, might seem like a safe option, but it was typically low in alcohol content and still carried risks of bacterial contamination. The beer was often thick and nutritious, more like liquid bread than modern beer, but it was brewed in conditions that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. Even if you somehow knew to avoid the most dangerous foods, you'd face the challenge of obtaining food in the first place. Food distribution in ancient Egypt was tightly controlled through a complex system of state-managed agriculture and redistribution. Without a recognized place in this system, without being a registered worker, priest, official, or slave, you'd have no legal access to food supplies. Your clothing situation would be dire from the moment you arrived. If you appeared in modern clothes, you'd immediately be marked as foreign and suspicious. But even if you somehow acquired period-appropriate clothing, you'd face problems you never anticipated. Ancient Egyptian clothing was primarily made from linen, derived from flax plants. This fabric was well suited to the hot, dry climate, but it required specific care and maintenance that you wouldn't understand. More critically, clothing was a clear indicator of social status, profession, and religious affiliation. Wearing the wrong thing could be interpreted as impersonation, blasphemy, or rebellion. The white linen worn by priests and nobles wasn't just about color, it was about purity and religious significance. Wearing white without the proper religious or social status could be seen as a serious offense against the gods. Similarly, certain colors, patterns, and styles were restricted to specific classes or professions. But beyond the social implications, the clothing itself would present practical problems. Ancient Egyptian sandals were made from papyrus or leather and were designed for feet that had been walking on sand and stone since childhood. Your soft, modern feet would develop painful blisters and infections within hours of walking in authentic Egyptian footwear. The lack of proper undergarments would lead to chafing and skin problems in the harsh climate. Ancient Egyptians had developed specific techniques for dealing with heat rash, fungal infections, and other skin problems caused by the combination of heat, sand, and rough textiles. You wouldn't know these techniques, and minor skin irritations would quickly become serious infections in the unsanitary conditions. Your hair would also mark you as an outsider. Ancient Egyptians had very specific hairstyles and grooming practices that varied by gender, age, social class, and profession. They often shaved their heads and wore wigs made from human hair or plant fibers. These wigs weren't just fashion statements. They were practical protection against lice, fleas, and the intense sun. Without understanding these grooming practices, you'd be immediately recognizable as someone who didn't belong. Even if you managed to navigate the immediate challenges of water, food, and clothing, your modern immune system would be completely unprepared for the disease environment of ancient Egypt. Diseases that had been eradicated in the modern world, or that your body had never encountered, would assault you from every direction. Malaria was endemic in ancient Egypt, carried by mosquitoes breeding in the Nile's marshy areas. Without modern prophylactics or treatment, malaria would cause recurring episodes of high fever, chills, and anemia that would progressively weaken you. Ancient Egyptians had some herbal treatments and had developed partial resistance through generations of exposure, but your immune system would have no such protection. Tuberculosis was rampant in the crowded, poorly ventilated living conditions of ancient Egyptian cities. The disease spread easily through airborne droplets, and without modern antibiotics, it was usually fatal. Even if you survived the initial infection, chronic tuberculosis would progressively destroy your lungs and other organs over months or years. Smallpox epidemics periodically swept through ancient Egypt, killing large portions of the population. If you encountered smallpox without vaccination, and ancient variolation techniques weren't developed until much later, you'd have roughly a 30% chance of dying from the disease itself, and survivors were often left blind or severely scarred. Polio was another constant threat, particularly to children, but adults without immunity were also vulnerable. The paralytic form of polio would leave you permanently disabled in a society with no accommodation for physical disabilities and no modern assistive devices. Various forms of dysentery and food poisoning would be constant companions. Your digestive system, accustomed to processed and sterile foods, would be under constant assault from bacteria and parasites that ancient Egyptians had adapted to tolerate. Chronic diarrhea would lead to malnutrition and dehydration, making you vulnerable to every other disease and infection. Skin infections would be particularly problematic. Cuts and scrapes that would heal easily with modern antiseptics and antibiotics would become serious infections in ancient Egypt. Staphylococcus and streptococcus bacteria would turn minor injuries into life-threatening sepsis. Even something as simple as an infected hangnail could kill you if it progressed to blood poisoning. Eye infections were extremely common due to the sandy, dusty environment and poor sanitation. Trachoma, caused by bacterial infection, would progressively damage your eyes and eventually lead to blindness. Ancient Egyptians had developed some treatments using honey and other antimicrobial substances, but without knowledge of these remedies, you'd be helpless against progressive eye damage. Even if you somehow survived the immediate biological threats, the social structure of ancient Egypt would present insurmountable challenges. Ancient Egyptian society was rigidly hierarchical, with every person having a specific place and role that was often determined by birth and maintained through complex systems of reciprocal obligations. At the top was the pharaoh, considered to be a living god whose word was absolute law. Below the pharaoh were the nobles, priests, and high officials who administered the kingdom. Then came the scribes, craftsmen, and merchants who formed something like a middle class. At the bottom were the farmers and laborers who made up the vast majority of the population, and below them were the slaves. Without proper documentation, family connections, or professional credentials, you'd have no place in this system. You couldn't simply show up and get a job. Employment was typically hereditary. Sons followed their fathers' professions, and daughters were trained for domestic roles. Professional guilds controlled access to skilled trades, and these guilds were closed to outsiders. Your inability to read and write hieroglyphs would be a massive disadvantage. Literacy was rare and highly valued, mostly limited to scribes and priests who underwent years of training. Without literacy, you'd be excluded from any administrative or religious roles, which were the primary paths to social advancement. The legal system would offer you no protection. Ancient Egyptian law was based on ma'at, the concept of cosmic order and balance. Legal proceedings assumed that everyone understood their place in society and their obligations to others. A person with no social connections, no family, and no recognized status would have no standing in legal disputes. Property ownership was complex and based on systems of royal grants, inheritance, and collective family ownership that you wouldn't understand. You couldn't simply buy land or establish a business. All economic activity was ultimately controlled by the state, either directly or through temple complexes that managed large estates. Your foreign appearance, inability to communicate properly, and lack of understanding of social customs would mark you as an outsider. In a society that was deeply xenophobic and suspicious of foreigners, this would make you a target for exploitation, violence, or enslavement. Ancient Egyptian religion permeated every aspect of daily life, and your ignorance of religious practices and beliefs would constantly put you in danger. This wasn't a society where you could simply avoid religious participation. Religion was integrated into law, social structure, work, and daily activities. Every day began with religious observances. Workers would make offerings to gods associated with their particular trades. Farmers would perform rituals related to the flooding of the Nile and the growing seasons. Even simple activities like baking bread or brewing beer had religious components. Your inability to participate properly in these religious activities would be noticed immediately. Failing to make proper offerings, not knowing the correct prayers or gestures, or accidentally violating religious taboos would mark you as either ignorant and therefore low status, or deliberately blasphemous and therefore dangerous. The Egyptian pantheon included hundreds of gods and goddesses, each with specific areas of influence, particular rituals, and complex relationships with other deities. Local variations meant that religious practices differed from region to region. What was proper in Memphis might be offensive in Thebes, and you'd have no way of knowing these distinctions. Many jobs and social roles had religious requirements. Priests underwent purification rituals, followed strict dietary restrictions, and were required to maintain ritual purity. Even non-religious jobs often had religious components. Soldiers made offerings to war gods, merchants honored gods of trade, and craftsmen paid respect to deities associated with their particular skills. Your modern secular worldview would be incomprehensible to ancient Egyptians. The idea that someone might not believe in gods, or might not know which gods to worship, would be seen as evidence of madness or evil influence. Atheism wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was literally inconceivable to the ancient Egyptian mind. Religious festivals were major social events that everyone was expected to participate in. These weren't optional celebrations. They were community obligations that reinforced social bonds and demonstrated loyalty to the gods and the pharaoh. Your absence from these festivals would be noticed and would further mark you as an outsider. If you somehow managed to survive long enough to find work, the nature of ancient Egyptian labor would likely kill you within weeks. The economy was based on agriculture and large-scale construction projects, both of which required physical capabilities that modern people simply don't possess. Agricultural work, which employed the majority of the population, was brutally demanding. Farmers worked with simple tools, wooden plows, copper sickles, and hand tools that were barely more sophisticated than sticks and stones. The workday began before dawn and continued until sunset, with only brief breaks during the hottest part of the day. Irrigation was done by hand, moving water from the Nile to fields through a complex system of canals and channels. Workers would spend hours in the hot sun, bent over in uncomfortable positions, moving water bucket by bucket. Your modern body, accustomed to air conditioning, ergonomic furniture, and regular breaks, would be crippled by muscle strain and heat exhaustion within days. Harvest time was particularly brutal. Workers had to cut grain by hand using copper sickles, then carry heavy bundles to threshing areas where oxen would trample the grain to separate it from the stalks. The work was dusty, dirty, and exhausting, and it had to be completed quickly before the grain spoiled or was consumed by insects and rodents. Construction work was even more demanding. The great pyramids and temples were built using human muscle power, ropes, ramps, and simple machines like levers and pulleys. Workers quarried stone blocks weighing several tons, transported them using wooden rollers and ramps, and lifted them into place using coordinated team efforts that required precise timing and enormous physical strength. The working conditions were horrific by modern standards. There were no safety equipment, no workers' compensation, and no medical care for work-related injuries. Workers were expected to provide their own tools and often their own food. Accidents were common and usually fatal, being crushed by falling stones, injured by broken tools, or disabled by repetitive strain injuries that never healed properly. The work schedule was relentless. Ancient Egyptians worked 6 days out of every 10-day week, with only religious festivals providing additional rest days. There were no vacation days, no sick leave, and no retirement. You worked until you died, became too disabled to continue, or were too old to be useful. Even skilled craftsmen faced challenges that would overwhelm modern workers. Metal workers labored over furnaces that reached temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius, with no protective equipment beyond leather aprons. Stone carvers worked in dusty conditions that would cause silicosis and other lung diseases. Textile workers spent long hours in repetitive motions that would cause severe arthritis and other joint problems. When you inevitably became sick or injured, and you would, probably within days, the ancient Egyptian medical system would be more likely to kill you than cure you. While Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time, it combined genuine medical knowledge with magical thinking and practices that would be horrifying by modern standards. Egyptian physicians did have some effective treatments. They understood basic anatomy from their mummification practices. They had effective treatments for some conditions using honey, which has natural antibiotic properties. And they had developed surgical techniques for treating wounds and setting bones. Some of their herbal remedies were genuinely effective. However, their understanding of disease was fundamentally flawed. They believed that illness was caused by blocked channels in the body, similar to how blocked irrigation channels would cause problems in agriculture. Their treatments often focused on purging the body through vomiting, diarrhea, or bloodletting, treatments that would weaken an already sick person and potentially introduce new infections. Many medical treatments were based on sympathetic magic, the idea that a patient with a snake bite might be treated with medicine containing ground-up snakes. Someone with eye problems might be treated with substances that resembled eyes. These treatments were not only ineffective but often actively harmful. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. While Egyptian surgeons were skilled at setting bones and treating wounds, any internal surgery would be agonizing and usually fatal due to infection. Even minor procedures carried enormous risks of sepsis and death. Dental care was particularly primitive and painful. Tooth problems were extremely common due to the gritty bread that wore down teeth, but treatment options were limited to extraction using crude tools and no pain relief. Many people died from infected tooth extractions that led to sepsis. Before we continue, let's drift for a minute. Now close your eyes and let the wind take you. Now let's continue. The medical system also had strong religious components. Many diseases were believed to be caused by divine punishment or demonic possession. Treatment often involved religious rituals, spells, and offerings to gods. If you were sick, you might be subjected to exorcism rituals that involved fasting, purging, and other practices that would weaken you further. Mental illness was not understood at all. Depression, anxiety, or any behavioral problems would be interpreted as spiritual problems requiring religious intervention. You might be subjected to harsh physical treatments designed to drive out evil spirits, or you might be isolated from society as someone cursed by the gods. The climate of ancient Egypt would present constant, life-threatening challenges that your modern body and mind couldn't handle. While Egypt is often portrayed as simply hot and dry, the reality was far more complex and dangerous. The desert sun was relentless and brutal. Without modern sunscreen, protective clothing designed for extreme heat, or air-conditioned refuges, you'd be facing daily temperatures that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius 104 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, when shade was available. The sun's ultraviolet radiation would cause severe sunburn within hours of exposure, leading to painful blistering and increased risk of skin cancer that would kill you over time. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke would be constant threats. Your body, accustomed to climate-controlled environments, wouldn't be adapted to regulate temperature in extreme heat. You'd lose dangerous amounts of water and electrolytes through sweating, and without modern understanding of heat illness treatment, you'd be at constant risk of collapse and death. The nights brought different challenges. Desert temperatures can drop dramatically after sunset, and without proper shelter and clothing, hypothermia would be a real risk. Ancient Egyptians had developed clothing and shelter systems adapted to these temperature swings, but you wouldn't know how to use them effectively. Sandstorms were frequent and dangerous. These weren't just inconvenient weather events. They were potentially deadly phenomena that could last for days. The sand and dust would get into your eyes, nose, mouth, and lungs, causing painful irritation and potentially serious respiratory problems. Without proper shelter and protection techniques, you could be lost in a sandstorm and die of exposure. The seasonal flooding of the Nile created periods of extreme humidity that would be unbearable combined with the heat. The standing water after floods would breed mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. The combination of heat, humidity, and insects would create conditions that would break down your physical and mental health rapidly. Wind patterns would carry dust and sand that would irritate your skin and respiratory system constantly. Ancient Egyptians had developed techniques for protecting themselves from these conditions, but you wouldn't know them. You'd be constantly uncomfortable, constantly at risk of respiratory infections, and constantly dealing with skin problems that could become serious infections. Ancient Egypt, despite its reputation for civilization and culture, was a violent society where death from human violence was a constant possibility. The combination of harsh living conditions, rigid social hierarchy, and limited resources created an environment where violence was often the solution to conflicts. Street crime was common in Egyptian cities. Thieves, desperate people, and organized criminal groups operated with impunity in many areas. Without police protection as we understand it, and without any knowledge of dangerous areas or protective techniques, you'd be an easy target for robbery, assault, or murder. The legal system itself was violent. Punishments for crimes included beatings, mutilation, and execution. Even minor offenses could result in severe physical punishment. As an outsider with no social connections or legal protection, you'd be particularly vulnerable to false accusations and harsh punishments. Workplace violence was common. Construction sites, docks, and other work areas were dangerous places where accidents and conflicts were frequent. Workers who couldn't keep up, who made mistakes, or who challenged authority were often subjected to beatings or worse. Supervisors had almost unlimited authority over workers, and abuse was common. Domestic violence was accepted and expected. Women and children had few legal protections, and physical punishment within families was considered normal and necessary. Even if you weren't directly involved in domestic violence, you'd be surrounded by a culture that accepted and promoted violence as a solution to social problems. Military conflicts were frequent. Egypt was constantly at war with neighboring kingdoms, dealing with internal rebellions, or conducting raids for slaves and resources. Civilian populations were often caught up in these conflicts, and cities were regularly attacked and plundered by enemy forces. Religious violence was also common. People accused of blasphemy, witchcraft, or offending the gods could be killed by angry mobs. Religious festivals sometimes turned violent, and conflicts between followers of different gods could result in serious violence. Your status as an outsider would make you particularly vulnerable to violence. Without family or community connections to protect you, without understanding of social rules and hierarchies, and without ability to communicate effectively, you'd be seen as fair game by anyone looking for someone to exploit or abuse. Personal hygiene in ancient Egypt, while more advanced than in many other ancient cultures, would still present serious health challenges that your modern body couldn't handle. The combination of limited water access, lack of soap, and unsanitary living conditions would create a cycle of infection and disease that would overwhelm your immune system. Bathing was a luxury available only to the wealthy, and even then, it was nothing like modern bathing. Most people cleaned themselves using natron, a naturally occurring salt, and water, if water was available. Soap as we know it didn't exist, and the cleansing agents available were harsh and often irritating to skin that wasn't adapted to them. Dental hygiene was virtually non-existent. Ancient Egyptians sometimes chewed on frayed sticks to clean their teeth, but they had no understanding of bacteria or the importance of removing plaque. Combined with their gritty diet, poor dental hygiene led to severe tooth decay, gum disease, and infections that could spread throughout the body. Parasite infestations were universal. Every ancient Egyptian had intestinal worms, lice, fleas, and other parasites. These weren't just uncomfortable, they were serious health threats that could cause anemia, malnutrition, and secondary infections. Without modern antiparasitic medications, you'd become part of this ecosystem of parasites, and your health would decline rapidly. Laundry was infrequent and ineffective. Clothes were cleaned by beating them against rocks and rinsing them in the Nile, the same water that was contaminated with sewage and parasites. Wet clothes had to be dried in dusty conditions, so they were never really clean. You'd be wearing clothes that were constantly contaminated with bacteria and parasites. Human waste disposal was primitive and dangerous. Most homes had no sanitation facilities, and waste was often simply thrown into the streets or into the Nile. This created a constant source of bacterial contamination that would spread disease throughout the community. Your modern understanding of sanitation would be useless without the infrastructure to implement it. Food preparation was done in unsanitary conditions with contaminated utensils and water. Cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods was common, and food storage methods allowed bacteria and parasites to multiply. Every meal would be a potential source of food poisoning or parasitic infection. The ancient Egyptian economy was fundamentally different from any modern economic system, and your complete ignorance of how it worked would leave you unable to survive economically. This wasn't a market economy where you could simply find a job and earn money to buy what you needed. The economy was based on a complex system of state redistribution. Most land was owned by the pharaoh or temple complexes, and workers were assigned tasks and given rations rather than wages. There was no free labor market where you could sell your skills to the highest bidder. Currency, as we understand it, didn't exist for most transactions. Trade was conducted through barter systems and standardized exchanges based on weights of grain, copper, or other commodities. Without understanding these exchange rates and systems, you'd be unable to participate in economic activity. Professional guilds controlled access to most skilled trades. These guilds were hereditary and closed to outsiders. You couldn't simply apprentice yourself to a craftsman. You had to be born into the right family or have the right connections. Even if you had modern skills that were valuable, you'd have no way to practice them legally. Employment was typically for life and tied to specific locations and social roles. You couldn't quit your job and find another one. Workers were assigned to specific tasks by government officials, and these assignments were often permanent. The concept of career mobility or professional development didn't exist. Tax obligations were tied to land ownership and social status in ways that you wouldn't understand. Everyone owed various forms of labor service to the state, but the specifics varied by region, social class, and time of year. Without understanding these obligations, you could easily find yourself in violation of tax laws and subject to severe penalties. Property rights were complex and based on royal grants, family inheritance, and religious dedication. You couldn't simply buy property or establish a business. All economic activity ultimately depended on royal permission and divine favor, both of which would be unavailable to you as an outsider. The language situation in ancient Egypt would create an insurmountable barrier to survival that goes far beyond simple communication problems. Language wasn't just about exchanging information. It was the key to every aspect of social, economic, and religious life. Middle Egyptian, the language spoken during the classical period, was completely different from any modern language family. Even if you somehow learned some vocabulary, the grammar, syntax, and conceptual framework were fundamentally alien. Egyptian thinking patterns, reflected in their language, were based on religious and social concepts that you wouldn't understand. Hieroglyphic writing was used for religious and formal purposes, but most daily communication used hieratic script, a cursive form that looked nothing like the hieroglyphs you might recognize. Even educated Egyptians had to learn multiple writing systems, and literacy was extremely rare and highly specialized. Regional dialects varied significantly, and what you might learn in one area would be partially incomprehensible in another region. Egypt was a large country with diverse populations, and language varied by social class, profession, and geographic location. Nonverbal communication was just as important as spoken language, and these customs were incredibly complex. Hand gestures, body positions, facial expressions, and spatial relationships all carried specific meanings that varied by social context. You'd be constantly sending wrong messages through your body language and behavior. Professional jargon was essential for any type of work. Farmers, craftsmen, priests, and officials all had specialized vocabularies that were necessary for functioning in their roles. Without knowing these specialized terms and concepts, you couldn't perform even basic tasks in any profession. Legal and religious language used archaic forms and ritual phrases that were incomprehensible even to ordinary ancient Egyptians. If you were involved in any legal proceedings or religious activities, your inability to understand or use proper formal language would mark you as incompetent and possibly dangerous. The social implications of language mistakes were severe. Using the wrong form of address, failing to show proper linguistic deference to social superiors, or making religious linguistic errors could result in punishment, social ostracism, or worse. Even if you somehow survived all the physical threats, diseases, violence, and social challenges, the psychological stress of ancient Egyptian life would eventually break your modern mind. The combination of constant fear, social isolation, physical discomfort, and cultural alienation would create mental health challenges that would be impossible to overcome. The constant threat of death would create severe anxiety and stress that your modern psyche couldn't handle. Every day would bring new life-threatening challenges: contaminated water, dangerous food, violent crime, disease, accidents, and social conflicts. The psychological toll of living in constant survival mode would be overwhelming. Social isolation would be complete and devastating. You'd be unable to form meaningful relationships due to language barriers, cultural differences, and social suspicion. Humans are social beings, and complete social isolation leads to depression, anxiety, and eventual mental breakdown. The loss of all familiar comforts and references would create severe disorientation and despair. Everything you knew about how the world works, technology, social systems, values, beliefs, would be completely irrelevant. You'd be like an infant in an adult body, having to relearn everything about how to exist in the world. The religious and philosophical framework of ancient Egypt would be incomprehensible and potentially terrifying to a modern mind. The constant presence of death, the capricious nature of the gods, and the rigid social hierarchy would challenge everything you believed about human dignity, individual rights, and personal freedom. The lack of privacy and personal space would be psychologically crushing. Ancient Egyptian society was communal in ways that would be claustrophobic to modern sensibilities. Every aspect of your life would be observed, judged, and controlled by others. The concept of individual privacy didn't exist. The physical discomfort would be constant and unbearable. Pain, hunger, thirst, heat, cold, itching, and general physical misery would be your constant companions. Modern people have no experience with chronic physical discomfort, and the psychological effects would be devastating. Sleep deprivation would be chronic due to uncomfortable sleeping conditions, noise, insects, temperature extremes, and constant anxiety. Poor sleep would impair your judgment, weaken your immune system, and contribute to psychological breakdown. The realization that there was no escape, no rescue, and no hope of returning to the modern world would create despair that could lead to complete psychological collapse or suicide. After examining all these challenges in detail, the conclusion is inescapable. You wouldn't survive in ancient Egypt. The combination of biological, social, economic, and psychological challenges would overwhelm any modern person within days or weeks at most. Your death would probably come from one of the early biological challenges: contaminated water causing severe dysentery and dehydration, food poisoning from unfamiliar and contaminated foods, or infectious disease from your first contact with the ancient disease environment. If you somehow survive these immediate threats, you'd eventually succumb to the chronic diseases, workplace violence, or social persecution that were endemic to ancient Egyptian life. Even in the unlikely event that you manage to survive long enough to adapt partially to some of these challenges, the psychological stress would eventually break you. The human mind wasn't designed to handle the complete loss of everything familiar combined with constant life-threatening stress. This isn't to diminish the achievements of ancient Egyptian civilization. The ancient Egyptians created one of history's most impressive cultures, with remarkable achievements in architecture, art, medicine, mathematics, and social organization. But they did so under conditions that would be unlivable for people adapted to modern life. The gulf between ancient and modern life is far greater than most people realize. It's not just a matter of lacking modern conveniences. It's about fundamental differences in disease environment, social structure, economic systems, and basic survival requirements. Ancient Egyptians were adapted to their environment through generations of natural selection, cultural evolution, and individual adaptation from birth. They had knowledge, skills, and physical capabilities that modern people lack, and they lived in social and economic systems that provided survival mechanisms we don't understand. Let's be brutally specific about how your death would likely unfold, because understanding the precise mechanisms of your demise illuminates just how hostile this ancient world would be to modern sensibilities. Scenario 1. Death by water, days 1 to 3. Your most likely cause of death would be water-related illness within the first 72 hours. Upon drinking Nile water or any local water source, you'd ingest a cocktail of pathogens that would immediately overwhelm your modern immune system. Vibrio cholerae would cause explosive diarrhea within 2 to 6 hours, leading to the loss of up to 20 liters of fluid per day. Without modern oral rehydration therapy, you'd lose dangerous amounts of water and electrolytes rapidly. Your blood pressure would drop, your organs would begin to shut down, and you'd experience severe muscle cramps as your body's electrical systems failed. Ancient Egyptians knew to give patients rice water and honey solutions, but you wouldn't know this, and even if you did, you wouldn't be able to keep anything down. The dehydration would cause your skin to lose elasticity, your eyes to sink into their sockets, and your tongue to become dry and swollen. Your heart would race as it struggled to pump thickened blood through your collapsing circulatory system. Within 24 to 48 hours, you'd fall into hypovolemic shock and die, conscious but helpless as your body systems shut down one by one. Scenario 2. Death by violence, days 1 to 7. If you somehow avoided immediate water-related death, violence would be your next most likely killer. Your obvious status as an outsider, combined with your inability to communicate or understand social cues, would make you a target for both criminals and authorities. Street thieves would see you as an easy mark, someone with no family or community protection, no understanding of dangerous areas, and no knowledge of self-defense techniques appropriate to the time period. They'd corner you in an alley, demand your possessions, and when you couldn't comply properly, because you didn't understand what they wanted or how to respond appropriately, they'd kill you with knives or clubs. Alternatively, the Medjay police would arrest you as a suspected foreign spy or madman. Ancient Egyptian interrogation techniques included beatings, burning, and other forms of torture designed to extract confessions. Unable to explain yourself satisfactorily, You'd be beaten to death during questioning or executed as a threat to state security. The violence would be brutal and personal. Ancient weapons like copper daggers, wooden clubs, and stone axes would cause traumatic injuries that would be agonizing and slow to kill. You'd die bleeding to death in a dusty street, surrounded by people speaking a language you couldn't understand, in a world that had no place for you. Scenario 3. Death by disease, weeks 1 to 4. If you survive the immediate threats, infectious disease would almost certainly kill you within the first month. Your modern immune system, adapted to a relatively sterile environment, would be completely overwhelmed by the disease load of ancient Egypt. Malaria would likely be your killer. Within 7 to 14 days of being bitten by infected mosquitoes, which would happen almost immediately in the Nile Valley, you'd develop high fever, severe chills, and anemia. The parasites would multiply in your red blood cells, causing them to rupture and release toxins into your bloodstream. Without modern antimalarial drugs, you'd experience recurring episodes of fever that could reach 106 degrees Fahrenheit, 41 degrees Celsius, high enough to cause brain damage and seizures. Between fever episodes, you'd be weak and exhausted as your body tried to replace the destroyed red blood cells. Each cycle would weaken you further. The malaria would likely progress to cerebral malaria, where the parasites would block small blood vessels in your brain. You'd experience confusion, hallucinations, and eventually coma. Your death would come from brain swelling and hemorrhaging, a process that could take several agonizing days during which you'd drift in and out of consciousness, experiencing terrifying delirium in a world you didn't understand. Scenario 4. Death by starvation, weeks 2 to 8. Assuming you somehow avoided waterborne illness, violence, and infectious disease, starvation would eventually kill you. Your complete inability to navigate the ancient Egyptian economic system would leave you without access to food. Starvation is a slow, horrible death that would unfold over weeks. Your body would first burn through its fat reserves, then begin consuming muscle tissue for energy. You'd experience constant hunger pangs, weakness, and dizziness. Your immune system would weaken further, making you vulnerable to every opportunistic infection. As starvation progressed, you'd develop edema, swelling from fluid retention. Your hair would fall out, and your skin would become dry and flaky. Your cognitive function would decline, making it even harder to find solutions to your situation. You'd become increasingly desperate and would likely die attempting to steal food, either killed by guards protecting grain stores or executed for theft. The final stages of starvation would involve organ failure as your body consumed vital proteins to keep your brain functioning. You'd die slowly, over days or weeks, as your heart, liver, and kidneys shut down from malnutrition. What makes survival in ancient Egypt impossible for modern people isn't just individual threats. It's how these threats would interact and amplify each other in cascading failures that would overwhelm any attempt at adaptation. The immune system cascade. Your first encounter with contaminated water would weaken your immune system, making you vulnerable to airborne diseases like tuberculosis. The TB infection would cause chronic coughing and weakness, making you less able to work and earn food. Malnutrition would further weaken your immune system, making you susceptible to secondary infections like pneumonia. Each illness would make you more vulnerable to the next, creating a downward spiral that would inevitably end in death. The social isolation cascade. Your inability to communicate would lead to social isolation, which would prevent you from learning survival techniques that ancient Egyptians took for granted. Without social connections, you'd have no one to warn you about dangerous foods, contaminated water sources, or unsafe areas. Your isolation would also make you a target for violence and exploitation, as people with no social protection were considered fair game for abuse. The economic exclusion cascade. Your lack of recognized status in the economic system would prevent you from obtaining food legally, forcing you to attempt theft or begging. Theft would lead to violent punishment or death, while begging would mark you as a social outcast worthy only of contempt. Your economic desperation would force you into increasingly dangerous situations until you were inevitably killed. The psychological breakdown cascade. The constant stress, fear, and discomfort would cause psychological breakdown, which would impair your judgment and decision-making abilities. Poor decisions would lead to more dangerous situations, creating more stress and fear. Eventually, you'd either become completely non-functional due to mental illness, or you'd make a fatal mistake due to impaired thinking. These cascading failures would make adaptation impossible. Even if you somehow managed to address one threat, others would emerge to overwhelm you. The ancient Egyptian environment was hostile in ways that created reinforcing cycles of destruction that modern people couldn't escape. To fully understand why you die so quickly, it's important to recognize the vast amount of survival knowledge that ancient Egyptians possessed and that you completely lack. This wasn't primitive ignorance, it was sophisticated adaptation to a challenging environment. Water management. Ancient Egyptians knew which water sources were safest at different times of year. They knew that water taken from certain parts of the Nile during flood season was more dangerous than water from other areas. They knew how to let water settle to reduce turbidity, how to strain it through cloth filters, and which plants could be used to clarify water. They knew that beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a safer alternative to water because the brewing process killed many harmful organisms. They knew how to make different types of beer with different alcohol contents for different purposes, and they understood the nutritional value of thick, bread-like beer. Food safety. Ancient Egyptians had complex knowledge about food safety that you'd lack completely. They knew which fish were safe to eat during which seasons, how to identify spoiled meat, and which preservation techniques worked for different types of food. They knew that certain combinations of foods were safer than others, that some foods needed specific preparation to be safe, and that timing of meals could affect health. They understood which foods were appropriate for people with certain illnesses and which foods could be used medicinally. Disease recognition and treatment. While ancient Egyptian medicine wasn't scientifically accurate by modern standards, it was remarkably effective for its time. Ancient Egyptians could recognize symptoms of various diseases and had treatments that, while often based on incorrect theories, sometimes worked. They knew which herbs had medicinal properties, how to prepare them, and how to combine them for maximum effectiveness. They understood basic wound care, how to set bones, and how to manage chronic conditions like arthritis and digestive problems. Social navigation. Ancient Egyptians understood the complex social rules that governed every interaction. They knew how to show proper deference to superiors, how to negotiate with equals, and how to manage relationships with subordinates. They understood the religious and social significance of various behaviors and could navigate the complex web of obligations and expectations that held society together. Environmental adaptation. Ancient Egyptians knew how to protect themselves from the harsh climate. They understood how to dress for extreme heat, how to find shade and create cooling, and how to recognize and treat heat-related illnesses. They knew how to predict weather patterns, how to prepare for sandstorms, and how to navigate the desert safely. They understood the seasonal patterns of the Nile flood and how to adapt their activities to take advantage of these patterns. Economic survival. Ancient Egyptians understood the complex economic relationships that determined access to resources. They knew how to participate in barter systems, how to calculate fair exchanges, and how to build the relationships necessary for economic survival. They understood their obligations to the state and to temple complexes, and they knew how to fulfill these obligations while still maintaining their own survival. They knew which trades and professions offered the best opportunities for advancement and how to position themselves advantageously within the economic system. The technological differences between ancient Egypt and the modern world would create survival challenges that go far beyond simply lacking modern conveniences. Ancient Egyptian technology was sophisticated but required specialized knowledge and skills that you wouldn't possess. Tool technology. Ancient Egyptian tools were made from copper, bronze, stone, and wood, and using them effectively required techniques and knowledge that took years to master. A copper axe doesn't work like a modern steel axe. It requires different striking techniques, different maintenance, and different safety precautions. Without understanding how to maintain copper tools, they'd become dull and useless quickly. Without knowing proper striking techniques, you'd injure yourself using them. Without understanding their limitations, you'd attempt tasks that would break the tools or cause dangerous accidents. Construction technology. If you were forced into construction work, your ignorance of ancient building techniques would make you useless and dangerous. Ancient Egyptian construction used sophisticated techniques for moving massive stones, creating stable structures, and managing large work crews that required precise coordination. Without understanding these techniques, you'd be unable to participate effectively in construction projects. You'd be a liability to work crews, unable to anticipate when ropes might break, when structures might collapse, or when your actions might endanger others. Agricultural technology. Ancient Egyptian agriculture used sophisticated irrigation systems, planting techniques, and crop management that required detailed knowledge of local conditions. You wouldn't know when to plant different crops, how to manage irrigation channels, or how to recognize plant diseases and pests. Your attempts at farming would result in crop failures that could starve not just you, but others who depended on the land you were working. In a society where agricultural productivity was literally a matter of life and death, your incompetence would make you actively dangerous to community survival. Transportation technology. Ancient Egyptian transportation relied on boats, animal power, and human labor using techniques that required specialized knowledge. You wouldn't know how to handle boats in Nile currents, how to work with oxen or donkeys, or how to participate effectively in human-powered transport projects. Without these skills, you'd be unable to travel safely or participate in the movement of goods and people that was essential to economic life. Your incompetence would make you a burden rather than a contributor to community survival. After this exhaustive analysis, the conclusion is clear and unavoidable. You would not survive in ancient Egypt. This isn't a matter of bad luck or poor preparation. It's a fundamental incompatibility between modern human adaptation and ancient Egyptian environmental demands. Biological incompatibility. Your modern immune system, digestive system, and physical capabilities are adapted to a world that didn't exist 4,000 years ago. The pathogens, parasites, and environmental challenges of ancient Egypt would overwhelm your biological defenses within days or weeks. This isn't something you could overcome through willpower or intelligence. It's a fundamental mismatch between your biological adaptation and the ancient environment. Social impossibility. Ancient Egyptian society had no place for someone with your background, knowledge, and capabilities. Every aspect of social organization, from family structures to economic systems to religious practices, was designed around assumptions and requirements that you couldn't meet. You couldn't fake your way into this society because the knowledge and skills required were too complex and too deeply integrated into every aspect of daily life. Technological helplessness. Your modern technological knowledge would be completely useless in ancient Egypt, while your ignorance of ancient technology would make you unable to perform even basic survival tasks. You'd be like someone trying to survive in a modern city without understanding money, transportation, communication, or any other basic systems. Except the consequences of failure would be immediate death rather than mere inconvenience. Psychological impossibility. Even if you somehow overcame all the practical challenges, the psychological stress of complete cultural displacement would eventually break your mind. Humans need familiar social structures, cultural references, and predictable environments to maintain psychological health. The complete absence of anything familiar, combined with constant life-threatening stress, would cause psychological breakdown that would make survival impossible. The cruelest irony is that your modern knowledge and capabilities, the things that make you successful in the 21st century, would actually make you less likely to survive in ancient Egypt than someone with no education or skills at all. Your expectations, assumptions, and mental frameworks would actively work against you in the ancient environment. A modern person dropped into ancient Egypt would die not because they were stupid or weak, but because they were adapted to a completely different world. Ancient Egyptians weren't somehow superhuman. They were simply adapted to their environment in ways that took generations to develop and that can't be replicated quickly. The ultimate truth. Survival in ancient Egypt required being born into that world, raised with its knowledge systems, adapted to its disease environment, and integrated into its social structures from birth. These weren't things you could learn quickly or fake convincingly. They were the product of lifelong adaptation and cultural inheritance that made ancient Egyptians capable of thriving in conditions that would kill modern people within days. This isn't a criticism of modern people or a romanticization of ancient life. It's simply recognition that human survival has always depended on adaptation to specific environments, and the gap between ancient and modern environments is too vast to bridge quickly enough to prevent death. In ancient Egypt, you wouldn't just be a fish out of water. You'd be a creature from another planet, utterly unprepared for the realities of human survival in a world without modern medicine, technology, social systems, or environmental protections. Your death would be swift, unpleasant, and absolutely inevitable. The gentle sound of wind across sand dunes, the distant call of ibis birds along the Nile, the the soft whisper of papyrus reeds swaying in the evening breeze. These sounds would be the last things you'd hear as consciousness faded, taking with it all your modern knowledge, all your 21st century capabilities, all your assumptions about how the world works. In ancient Egypt, these things that define you would become irrelevant within hours, and you join the countless others who learned too late that survival isn't about what you know. It's about what you're adapted to endure. And with that realization, as your modern mind finally accepts the inevitable, the ancient world would claim another victim, and the eternal rhythm of the Nile would continue, indifferent to your struggle, indifferent to your knowledge, indifferent to everything except the timeless truth that survival belongs to those who are prepared for the world they find themselves in.